Hey everyone, Wayne Fox here with another video about the MacBook Pro. I've got a real collection in front of me. First, thought I'd mention my new hat. I got this, my daughter gives me a new hat every Christmas. This one's pretty cool because it's kind of a waterproof material in the brim shape, so the water kind of runs off. Main reason I picked it today is because it matches my shirt, but it's pretty comfortable. I don't like to cut my hair in the winter time and it gets really shaggy, so it's easier just to cover most of it up with a hat, let a little hang out the sides, easier than trying to keep it straight. So anyway, so while the MacBook Pros, well, in the video I did recently comparing the 16-inch MacBook Pro to the 2019 MacBook Pro, now they're both 2019 models obviously, one of the comments was it'd be kind of nice if I used more typical files that photographers would use. So I thought, well, that makes sense. And I got the idea of comparing several generations of MacBook Pros in a lot of different tests so that you could see if you're running a 2018 MacBook Pro, what kind of performance might you expect if you decided to bite the bullet and buy the new 16-inch MacBook Pro, or even if you're running an older one and you want it, maybe you can get a good deal on a used one and is it really worth it? So what I've got here, I've got the 2015, the last one Apple made that was before the USB 3 style Thunderbolt 3 ports. I've got the 2016 MacBook Pro. Okay, I've got the 2016 MacBook Pro, I think, and the 2018 MacBook Pro. One of those is one. I can't remember which one I put where. Right here, I've got the 2019 MacBook Pro that's now gone. I ran all the tests on it, so I have those available, but I had to give it back to my buddy. And then I've got my new 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is actually recording me right now, tied to my A7R4 camera. Now, as a photographer, when you're using Photoshop, I've decided, first of all, a lot of photographers don't use Photoshop that much anymore. And when you're using Photoshop, you might do something that takes 10 seconds on one machine versus 8 seconds on another, or even 20 seconds on one and 10 seconds on another. And so even though if you ran an action that had 47 steps in it, it might take 4 minutes longer. You really don't notice the speed that much because it's a couple seconds here and it's a second there and a few seconds here. In Lightroom, a lot of times it's the same way. When you're in the develop module, one machine might feel a little bit less sluggish than the other, but it's not really significant. But as a photographer, there are several things we do in Lightroom that do take a long time. And so what I decided to do is build my tests around those, because if you just get back from a shoot and you have 1,000 files to import from the wedding you just shot, or you're out shooting landscapes and you've got 600 files to import, well, you got to suck all those into your Mac and into Lightroom. And the other thing is that's really surprising is, let's say that you did a wedding and you want to export 600 files and you've processed them all. Well, believe it or not, the minute you start processing them, that dramatically increases the length of time it takes for Lightroom to export those. So what I developed was a bunch of tests that really show that 5 of the 6 tests are actually how Lightroom performs in things that are kind of time consuming and make you have to start the process and go grab a bite to eat or something while it's running. So what I'm going to do is first of all, let's talk about each machine and what the specs are. The interesting thing is I paid about the same price for each machine, even though each one is quite a bit different. The exception is the 16-inch MacBook Pro. I paid more for it because I decided to bite the bullet and get the 64 gigabytes of RAM, which I didn't need to get the 4 terabyte hard drive instead of the 2, which I like doing, but it costs quite a bit more. Had I bought the 2 terabyte hard drive and the 32 gigs of RAM, it would have cost me about the same price as all the others. We're talking, most of them are $3,200 to $3,400 machines when they were new. So we'll talk about the specs of each one. Most of them are close to the top at the time that they were released. Some of them were the top machine at the time it was released. We'll talk about the tests, how I set them up, how I kind of recorded everything. And then we'll just get into the results, and at the end I have this nice big chart, and you can actually compare if you got this one to this one, you can kind of see the jump. Now, if you're not shooting that camera, computers, we need a little bit faster because all the files are getting bigger and bigger. Almost all the makers now have a camera that's shooting at least 50 or close to 50 megapixels. And I think we're probably only a year or two out before we'll start seeing 70 megapixels in a mirrorless style 35 millimeter camera. So obviously, having a little power is helpful. It's nice if you can get it in a laptop because you can only need one computer. The new Mac Pro is pretty awesome, but I ain't going to spring for that. And as I run these tests, under most things, I don't think it'll help anyway. It's really not. Photoshop is really lousy at utilizing multi-core processors. Anyway, let's jump over and get into it.
Okay, so let's just go ahead and list out all of the hardware. The first one, of course, is the mid-2015 MacBook Pro. It's a 15-inch machine. They're all 15-inch. This one has a 2.8 gigahertz 4-core i7 processor. It has 16 gigabytes of 1600 megahertz DDR3 RAM. Now, one thing I'll comment about, the RAM is probably more important than people realize, and one of the reasons the machines are getting faster is more than just the processor. And when we get down to the last machine, you'll see how significantly faster RAM is in these newer machines. It also has a Radeon RN M370X 2 gigabyte graphics card and has a 1 terabyte SSD. So all 5 machines have an SSD in them. The 2016 MacBook Pro has a 2.9 gigahertz 4-core i7 processor with 16 gigabytes of 2133 megahertz DDR4 RAM. Now, I don't know the difference between DDR3 and DDR4. I assume that probably enhances accessibility and speed. I might have to look that up just because I'm curious now. Has a Radeon Pro 460 4 gigabyte graphics card and has a 2 terabyte SSD. The 2018 MacBook Pro comes with a 2.9 gigahertz 6-core i9 processor. And this is the Generation 8 i9. I'm not sure what the generations have to do with it, but I think the Gen 9 one is a little faster than the Gen 8 one. It has a 32 gigabytes of 2400 megahertz DDR4 RAM, a Radeon Pro 560X a graphics card with 4 gigabytes of memory, and a 2 terabyte SSD. The 2019 MacBook Pro has a 2.3 gigahertz 8-core i9 Gen 9 processor, a little bit better than the 2018. Has 32 gigabytes of 2400 megahertz DDR4 RAM. Has the Pro Vega 20 graphics card with 4 gigabytes of RAM and a 2 terabyte SSD. And finally, the last one, the MacBook Pro 16-inch, the new one. It has the same processor, 2.3 gigahertz 8-core i9 Generation 9 processor, but it has 64 gigabytes of 2667 megahertz DDR4 RAM. Now, if you look at the difference between that and the 2015 one in 4 years, we've gone from 1600 megahertz to 2600 megahertz, significantly faster, and the DDR3 to DDR4. So I think one of the reasons the last 3 do better is mainly a lot has to do with the RAM. It has the Radeon RX Vega 56 graphics card with 8 gigabytes of memory, and it has the 4 terabyte SSD. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the setup. Basically, on the 3 older machines, I erased the SSD and I reinstalled the operating system. On the 2 newer machines, because they're currently in use by either me or my friend, I actually just made a new user and booted into the new user. Try to eliminate as many background tasks as I can to keep it as fair as possible. The way I measure the times, I basically did a 4K video of each screen while the tests were running, and then I could go back and find the exact start and end point of the tests. So the length of time is pretty precise. I also used Intel Power Gadget, Activity Monitor, and I used a Max Fan Control, and those were all on the screen at the same time. And that lets me go back and review the video, and I can actually see what's going on with the CPU, how fast it's running, how efficiently the cores are being used, if the GPU is being used at all, and of course how fast the fans are spinning up, just to see if there's any thermal limiting going on in any of the machines. I had Mac OS Catalina 0.2 installed on all the machines, and I was using the most current Lightroom Classic, which is 9.1, as well as Photoshop 2020, which is version 21.0.2 release, I believe is the version on that. I don't know why they call it 2020, then they have numbers. It's like Photoshop Classic is 2019 and or Lightroom Classic is 2019, and yet Photoshop is 2020. It's okay, why isn't Lightroom Classic 2020? And of course Lightroom is version 9, and it's like, well, why isn't it just version 2020? I don't know. Adobe's does some weird things lately. Anyway, that's how the machines were set up. So let's go ahead and get into the actual results of the tests. Okay, so the first test was to import 500 Sony A7R4 files. These are the full 61 megapixel uncompressed versions of the files. And I used the Sidecar and embedded preview choice. The files were on an external Thunderbolt 3 SSD with a very fast write speed, and they were being copied to the internal SSD in the process. So results of the tests are pretty clear. All of the machines did this fairly quickly. This is the fastest way to get your files onto the computer. It's actually more efficient than doing a Finder copy. The only one that was a little slower was the original 2015, where it was 1 minute and 49 seconds. So the new one is 30 seconds faster. So I don't know, that's about 25% faster. So some nice speed increase. So the next test, I had Lightroom make a one-to-one preview of all those files. Now, some people don't bother with one-to-one previews, and this is a fairly slow process. I don't like to do it when I import the files unless I don't need to use the computer for a while. Then I actually do it when I import them. I personally make a one-to-one preview of every file because I want to check for focus. And if you have a one-to-one preview already made, then you can go very quickly in the library module and you can look at focus jumping one to another. If you don't make those in advance, then you're going to have to wait several seconds between each file to check focus while it prepares that preview. So anyway, again, we can see that the 16-inch MacBook Pro is the fastest. And if you compare it, it's twice as fast, or it did it in half the time of the 2015 MacBook Pro. Pretty significant difference on these, and each generation gets better, especially the last three. So the next test, which is something that photographers tend to have to do, is to export a lot of files. So I had Lightroom export all of those 500 files. I had no modifications made to the files, so they were just in their original state, and they were set to export as a 4,000 pixel on the long dimension file and at JPEG level 60. And you can see again that the newer the machine, the faster it was able to accomplish this task. The 2015 MacBook Pro did it 1754, so pretty much almost 18 minutes, whereas the new 16-inch did it in 10 minutes and 22 seconds. I'm surprised that the 16-inch is almost 10% faster than the previous 2019-inch. I'm not sure where the difference is coming from. I'll have to look and see if maybe it was the thermals, maybe the clock speed can go a little faster, because that really is about the only difference in the machine, other than the RAM is also a little faster. So the next test is a little more probably likely scenario where you're exporting 500 files, but they've all been modified in the develop module. And this takes significantly longer than exporting the unmodified files. So basically on each file, I added a few global changes. I added 10 dust spots. I added 2 graduated filters, and I did that to the first file, and then I synced all of those across to all the other files. Then I took the XMP sidecar file from that first file and I copied it to the other machines. I read that into the first file of the other machines and then synced it. So every file had the exact same changes made to it in the develop module. And the results of that, you can see the 16-inch MacBook Pro took 27, almost 28 minutes. So it goes from 10 minutes to 28 minutes, almost 3 times as long once you've made modifications. The 2015 MacBook Pro was 40 minutes, so it's a long time. That's a long time to wait for your computer to get back. And notice that the 2015 MacBook Pro is actually faster than the original 2016 MacBook Pro in the new style. And this is true of all of the remaining tests. That 2016 MacBook Pro does not really perform very well stacked up against any of the others. If you want to buy a used one of those, I recommend you don't. So the fifth test, I had files to create 5 panoramas. These are from an IQ 180 camera or digital back, so they're 80 megapixel files. And in the 5 panoramas, I had everything from 6 shots to 12 shots to merge. And basically, I stacked them all up, and then I did a panorama merge with the new feature where you can do those as in a group. And I timed how long it took to make all 5 of those merges. And you can see that the 16-inch MacBook Pro is able to do it in about 6 minutes, where it took 16 minutes for the 2015 MacBook Pro. Again, the 2016 MacBook Pro is even slower than the 2015, but all of the ones after that, the 2018, 2019, and 16-inch, are significantly faster. Now, one thing that's interesting about this test, this is the one thing in Lightroom is not very good at utilizing multiple cores. All of the other tests I've done so far, when you run those tests, it's pretty much maxing out the processor. You're getting almost a full processor utilization. When it gets into panorama merges, it's much less efficient, and I assume that has some legacy software they've borrowed from Photoshop because it acts very much like Photoshop. Maybe that's really hard to thread that and to utilize the cores. I don't know, but The newer machines, I'm assuming it's faster mainly because of the faster RAM. I'm guessing has a big part to do with it. Okay, so the final test was to run Puget Systems 2019 Photoshop benchmark test. This is a company that makes high-end workstations specifically designed to run Photoshop and I think Adobe Premiere. They're all Windows-based machines, but the test will run on anything that's running Photoshop. So it's kind of fun to compare how Macs do as well. Time of the test is only one part of it. One thing you'll notice about when you run this test, and I'll show you this in a second, Photoshop is really inefficient at threading multiple cores, and it's very few tasks does it really maximize the cores. Now, the good news is because of the new modern architecture and the chips, that means that even though you're only using 1 or 2 cores, they're going to way overclock and you're going to get up to the 4.5 gigahertz speed. So it's using less cores, but it's also using the ones that's using much faster, which I think is why the computers are getting a little faster in running this benchmark. Anyway, the 16-inch MacBook Pro ran at about 28 minutes, and I think the 2019 was almost identical. Makes sense because they have the exact same processor. You'll see that the 2016 MacBook Pro again lost, was the slowest of all of them, but the 2015 MacBook Pro took 37 minutes, so about 25% longer. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Photoshop's not really as important for a couple of reasons. First, I think photographers are using it less and less. We're using it mainly just to fix little things. Now, there are still some that do extensive work in Photoshop. But second, when you're using Photoshop, you don't notice the speed as much because you're doing a short task and a short task. So as I mentioned, difference between 8 seconds and 10 seconds or 10 seconds and 14 seconds. Yeah, it's going to take you 5 minutes overall. So, it still is important to value your time, but it certainly doesn't feel like it. Whereas the other tests, if you have the machine side by side, one of them's going to finish way before the other one, 10, 15 minutes before the other one. So here I just created a bar chart that shows all of the machines and all of the different tests, and it kind of puts everything as far as a time scale. And as you can see, the 16-inch MacBook Pro is the winner in every category, and by a decent amount in 2 or 3 of the categories. If you're thinking of buying that machine, it probably would be, if you've got an old 2016, it'd be a nice speed increase. Even buying a 2019 or even a 2018 would probably be a nice upgrade for you as well. So now what I want to do is I want to actually show some of the tests on the screen just to give you an idea of what, and talk about some of the results. And this is interesting because you'll see how the cores work and how it heats up and how the processors work. I'll try to make this pretty brief. It's kind of interesting for those that want to watch. So this part of the video is mainly to give you an understanding of, first of all, how I did the test and how I did the comparisons, and also maybe understand a little bit about why certain computers do better than others and what it would take to actually improve performance. So this is the video capture of my 16-inch MacBook Pro. If I go down here in the timeline, I can scroll through, and each of my tests are broken into different segments. Here on the screen, you can see on the left side is activity monitor. This is showing the activity of each core. Now understand that this is a history, so that whatever's happening currently is coming in from the right. So at the beginning of the test, none of this information applies, but once the test starts and as I scroll across, you'll see that all of this is what's going on. Now you'll notice in this particular test how much of the red is here, and the red is system level activity. And because we're actually reading from a disk drive or a SSD and we're all writing to an SSD, that's all basically happening at the system level. Lightroom is just sending instructions to the computer, says I need to do this, but it's the operating system that's actually doing the brunt of the work. And that's one thing I comment a lot of people, that you really don't need to use the Finder because it actually does and sends the exact same directions. It's not like safe or any better, it's just an application. So in this first test, there's a lot of red. If we go into the other tests, you'll notice that as we scroll across, it's pretty green. Now over here, you'll notice that I've got activity monitor showing me my current CPU percentage. And right now it's showing around 1500 and some odd percent. And it seems like an odd number, but basically what Apple does is each core is they equate to 100%. So if you have an 8-core computer, which has 8 virtual cores, that's equivalent to 16 cores. Now the virtual cores don't function as efficiently or do as much work as the real cores, but if they're built right, they can still carry a lot of the load as the program creates all of the threads that have to go through. So basically it's like a speedometer. It can go to 0 to 120, and the maximum percentage of CPU on one computer is 1600, and on another it might only be 800. So this gives me information on how much computer power there's being used. The other critical part in this test is the frequency, and this shows me the frequency of the CPU. Now there's two parts to this. One is the frequency average of all 8 cores, and the other is the actual maximum. And you notice in this case, it's pretty much a straight line. And even though this is a 2.3 gigahertz computer, notice the line at 2.3 right here, you'll see that in this process, Lightroom is maintaining around 3 to 3.1 gigahertz frequency. And it even goes a little faster. If you go a little further here, you'll see that it's actually going a little bit faster. So not only is it utilizing a huge amount of the CPU, available percentage, almost 100% of the available percentage, it's doing it very quickly. Now, one of the things to understand is there's two ways to make this go faster. If you have a process that's like this, that's very good at using multiple cores, then adding more cores is going to speed it up because it'll still be able to use those cores probably as efficiently. Now, I haven't been able to test this. I'd love to try this on a 28-core Mac Pro, and maybe I'll convince the Apple Store to let me try it sometime. One thing that's cool about it is I have all this data, so I can make these exact same tests on any computer in the future to get a comparison. But the other thing you can do is you can speed the processor up. Now, you'll notice here that my core temperature is only 87 degrees. So in theory, Apple could crank up this frequency. It would use a little more power, and maybe there's some issues up here. But it could crank the frequency up to 3.3, 3.4 gigahertz, let this temperature go up to 95, 96 degrees or whatever it is, and thus everything would get even faster. And that's why I think there is still a little bit of, I think Apple is intentionally trying to keep the thermals more in the 85-degree range, and despite the fact that it doesn't run quite as hot as the last one, it still runs faster. So I can turn this off on any layer, and I can see what another computer does. Now you'll notice as I go through these, you'll see that the last three, this is the 2018 right here. Notice when I go to the 2016, in the same process, I'm not getting near as much utilization. Now this is a 4-core processor, which means that 800% is the potential maximum. And as you can see, I'm running at 500, 550. So the 2016 is not able to run this task as efficiently as the other three. I'm not sure why that is. If you look over here, you'll see that the temperature is, not a real problem. And then last of all, we can just pop down and see the 2015. And again, you'll see that the 2015 is not capable of maximizing the core usage as well. It's very similar to the 2016. One other thing to note here is each test you'll see it takes the same amount of length in my timeline, even though if you look at the end of this test, we go and we show the 16-inch MacBook Pro. I keep wanting to call it a 2016 MacBook Pro. And so what I've done is I've added a timer and synchronized it so that the timer itself is showing you how long the process took. The advantage of that is if I scroll through this, at any given point, I'm at a similar part of the project or the test. So if I go here, if I turn that off, you'll see that I'm at a similar part of the same test. So it doesn't match up exactly because I don't have my CPU history set to the same width, but it still does compare relative to how far the process is completed in each computer. The other thing I can do is I can take these and I can go side by side, and then I can crop part of it out and make a video. So this is taking each of the CPU histories of all the 5 machines on the process of creating the preview files. And what I can do here is as I scroll through, this gives me a really good idea about which computer is able to really utilize the CPU and the cores. You'll notice that the 2019 MacBook Pro is actually the most efficient. The fewer black spots in this green area, the more efficient the CPU is being used. So out of 800%, which is the potential, remember it's each core times 100, out of 800% potential, the 2015 is only able to use about 500 to 600% of its CPU power, whereas the 16-inch MacBook Pro is approaching 1600% quite a bit. Now, I'm not sure why every once in a while it pops above that to 2000. Haven't quite figured that out. It's very rare. So it's still, and it's all just a reference number anyway. Basically, it's just letting us know the computer's running really efficiently. And you'll notice that the 2018, 2019, and 16-inch MacBook Pro all are very good with the current version of Lightroom at utilizing the cores. And for some reason, the 2016s and the 2015s aren't. And I don't know if that's because there's another bottleneck in those processes, so it just can't supply the data to the cores fast enough. Maybe that's something to do with the RAM speed, because these three all have faster RAM than these two. I don't know. The other thing that's interesting to look at, if I go here and show you the similar comparison on Photoshop, and you'll notice in Photoshop, we're just never able to actually, I mean, there's some areas where we're using a lot of cores, but there's no place where we really maximize the core usage. Photoshop really can't thread the machine very well. And this is the 16-inch MacBook Pro at the bottom, showing me my percentage. And I never even get to 50% of the available. So 800% would be about half the available CPU usage, but I never am able to get to that. And that's where it comes in handy to know that clock speed. So let's go back to the other one really quick and just look at Photoshop. Let's go to the Photoshop test. And you'll notice that in this test, if I follow the clock speed on the, I'm running at above 4 gigahertz for most of this test, but you'll notice if I look over here, a lot of times I'm really only hitting one processor hard. Now, it's using a lot of processors some of the time, so it is multi-threading fairly efficiently, but it can't max those cores out. It can't really hit to the full potential of the CPU. And you'll notice I'm not really getting a lot out of my graphics processor down here either. Now, if I show this in the 2015 MacBook Pro, I've got the same thing. You'll notice that I'm able to really maintain that processor close to 4 gigahertz. The main line to notice is the dark blue line. The blue area is the average of all of the cores. I'm not sure what the red is. I haven't figured, can't find anywhere online tell me what REQ means, if that's requested or, I don't know. Now, it is able to max at 4 once in a while, but that just shows you that in Photoshop, the cores are important, but also the speed of the CPU. So I'm not sure a 6-core 3.2 gigahertz machine would actually run Photoshop. I'm guessing faster than an 8-core 2.3 gigahertz machine. Although, as you've seen, if I compare the two, even though this is only a 2.3 gigahertz computer, I can still run at 4 gigahertz. Right now, it's hit a maximum of 4.6 and averaging 4.22. So because Photoshop isn't really pushing those cores, then it's able to clock the CPU up. So I'm not sure a faster CPU would really help because it's able to overclock the CPU. And this is a 20-some-minute test, 27-minute test. And if I scroll through this whole test, you'll see that CPU speed stays pretty constant. It doesn't over time drop off. I mean, here we're more than 15 minutes into the test, and we're running at 4 gigahertz. So, with modern CPUs, because of the way Photoshop works, I think, you're probably better off getting the most cores you can, because I think when it doesn't need all the cores, it's going to clock up. So if you can get a 14-core iMac Pro, that probably would outperform the current MacBook Pro, the 16-inch. But for me, that's the 16-inch MacBook Pro's got really, I've been really happy with the power and the speed I'm getting out of it. So, well, that about does it for this video. It was kind of a fun one to make, a lot of tests, but fortunately, most of the tests I had the machine sitting off to the side and was able to keep working on my other machine, so it didn't tie it up. Definitely shows for photographers there are some advantages to buying a more modern MacBook Pro. I think that, if you want to get really technical, I think that the iMac Pro, especially get into that 28-core one or the 14-core one, it might be a little bit faster. But most of the stuff you do in Photoshop and Lightroom, the cores aren't really critical. If you're doing a ton of exporting out of Lightroom, and we're talking thousands and thousands of files, then I think the more cores and the faster the machine will benefit you, because that is one process that Lightroom is very good at threading and utilizing all of the cores. If you're like me and you're really not hardly ever exporting, all you're doing is working on your pictures and then printing them, it's just nice to have the speed when you're making the one-to-one previews, and it overall feels peppier. But, I really didn't need the 16-inch MacBook Pro, and I'm not really feeling it's that much faster because I'm really not doing any of the things like that. So anyway, hey, thanks for watching the video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel down there below and ring the bell so that got some other cool videos I'm working on pretty soon. And in the meantime, take care. See ya.